which is part two of the future of AGI. I believe John Smart couldn't make it, so we have 4 talks this time, followed by a panel discussion, shorter than the last one. And yeah, well. So first up, we have Florin Popescu on the topic of what is dexterity, a bit of a shift from the ethical preoccupations of the previous session.
Well, it's not so much of a shift, because what you can see, that picture is chosen for a reason. That shows the fight between the mythical titans, and what you see is basically one species castrating and taking over the other. And that's between Uranus and Cronus, of course. And so my talk is on what is dexterity, and I hereby claim the extra minutes from Bob's talk. Because I have a lot of stuff to talk about. So here, while I talk about the definitions of this and that, let me start some cool videos. And okay, so what is dexterity? So as most broad concepts, the definition is a little bit circular and vague. Adroit inference means handy directly. So, but by intuition, by definition, right, the concept of intelligence and handiness and dexterity are directly linked. And what you just saw over there, if you were paying attention, you saw an overhead kick by a South American soccer player, and that's an example of dexterity. It's things that the other 2 robots, the big dog and the Sony robot cannot do right now, or at least not even unless you pre-program them to do that. And I just wanted you to pay attention to the fact that there's another animal that can do that, and that's a dolphin, and that it learned by itself to do this cool pet trick. So in general, you can see that dexterity has something to do with movement and how fast it is and how flexible it is, but there's clearly an intelligence factor there, the intelligence factor that robots currently lack. And moving on. All right. So the evolution of human motor control. How did that happen? Well, it was thought since the 1920s that the evolution of human intelligence involved new brain areas that would come up and would deal with different cognitive tasks that we needed throughout evolution. This has been, this is a popular view, and most people think that because of the popular science work of Steven Pinker. However, this is out of date research-wise. It is now thought that basically human evolution came through a scaling up of the brain. All the parts are basically similar in relative size to what they were in other earlier hominids. And the one thing that might be different is the laterality of the brain, so the right-left laterality of the brain. But otherwise, dolphins also evolved from similar animals in the group of what's called a clade. Two things they have in common, right? So highly convoluted cortex that's much more than their cousins, and you can see the 2 fine examples there in beautiful pictures. One shows connectivity, the other one shows the cortex itself. There's other things that maybe are not so clear, but they're clear to people who study motor control like me. Cerebellum, there's a very big cerebellum. That helps in doing some of the computations. And there is there's a very large corticospinal tract, which is a set of neurons which go directly from the brain to the muscle, bypassing a lot of the spinal circuitry that's used by more simpler animal to simplify control. And, we talked about earlier using 2 or 3 degrees, 2 or 3 actuators in a virtual world. Well, humans have thousands of actuators, or the order of thousands of actuators, and order of tens of thousands of sensors. So that's got to have something to do with it, and also the amount of direct control that the brain has. So essentially, the bodies, the muscles, are extension of the brain itself, or become one in humans. There's also a skeletal muscular architecture that changed throughout evolution, obviously, and that's a related story, but a side story. And a little bit about motor control. Now, it used to be thought that things are simplified at the spinal cord level, about 10 years ago. And this is known as the equilibrium point hypothesis, and that made things easier to control for very simple 6502 type architectures at the time. But the evidence doesn't point to that, and I've done some work on that. And what instead shows up is a hypothesis that goes back to the 80s from Michael Jordan, who claimed essentially that the brain, the cortex and the cerebellum, can perform arbitrary inverse dynamic mappings and learn them, and they'd be stable and generalized. And this is known as the inverse dynamics hypothesis. And clearly there's some of that going on right now as I speak, as vocal cords can produce almost any sound, and the hand can draw any shape whatsoever. So there's flexibility involved in that as well. And all this stuff, what is still not known from an evolutionary perspective is there's a dark age, there's a gap. Apparently we evolved about 200,000 years ago, but culture and the big bang of human evolution and the migration out of Africa only happened about 40,000 years ago. So what happened in the meantime? How did this evolve? What were the pressures that created this? And hopefully I didn't. Yes. So evolution. So what's going on? And we need to pay a little bit close attention to how evolution functions. It's a stochastic dynamic system, right? And I like that picture a lot because it shows the output. It's basically the hominid line of evolution, but it shows the output of a complicated stochastic process, right? And kind of what happens, if you can reduce it a little bit even to somebody that's not a geneticist like me, is that populations diminish due to some pressure. And under this stress, the mutations have a higher chance of new species creation, or a mutation has a higher chance of propagating itself throughout the species. And this means survival and eventually thriving to a large population and a large area, and then some new event or some new competitor comes along, and this thing, and there's a crisis, and the population diminishes again, and there's another mutation, and so on, and this is how evolution seems to work. And there's a lot of stochastic modeling of this when intelligence emerges and things that are really complicated, such as ability for language. Then you get some things that are just implausible. So the language organ, which has never been found, right? It's all been hypothesized, talked about, never been found. This thing would not make sense as a mutation, right? So if I'm a baby that has the language ability and my parents don't have the mutation, I can't learn language. So it's implausible. There's a dynamic mechanism which lets this happen. So the actual genetic mechanisms to encephalization haven't really been found, but they're being looked at, and they're complicated. But there was something about the environment. Something about the environment itself that made it better overall, a better strategy for humans to develop what's called general intelligence rather than create bigger bodies. So the Neanderthals tried that path, and it didn't work out for them. And now, since we talk about dexterity, and this is a mathematical conference, so I need to talk about, like, in brief about some kind of formal exposition of dexterity. And so I just want to talk model motor activity as the interaction between agent and environment. But the environment is not just a bunch of rocks that we pile up, or it's not like a Mars rover. The environment is smart, it's active. The environment is made of other members of our species and other species. And I've broken it down, removing a couple of layers that AI people like to to put, such as cognition. And I've broken them down into perception, action, and reaction. And it's the environment that reacts. And this, in motor control parlance, it's called impedance. That's a differential equation. But it's much more than just soft bodies and rigid bodies, and so it's intelligent. I've written an equation there. It's kind of small, but you can see that what I've did is I've defined dexterity as the speed in time with which an agent may modify the structural complexity of the environment. And structural complexity is kind of like cosmological complexity, but it's lower than that. So that's. But think about the structural complexity as, looking from outer space and you see all the stuff that's going on, and you see the pyramids, and things appear, and now things are super complicated, the things you could see from space or from the plane or from Google Maps. And just one point. The machine that did this, there's people talking about making emulations on massively parallel machines that will use terawatts or gigawatts of power. The brain has 20 watts of power. The muscles consume another 50 watts of power. That's what made this whole thing that we see, right? And we can put bounds on that, and there's a lot of theory working on how much energy we use and what we do with it and so on. But okay, so let's add it up. So in order to elucidate the mystery of what happened in evolution and why we need brains and how we get there, I propose that we make a complicated simulation, not just a differential equation, but something much more ambitious and complicated that's been attempted so far. So, the way it came about is because we have some high school kids at the institute, right, who've been very successful using and going to robot. All right, doing the RoboCop Junior World Championship, and I noticed, and I've been helping now. They spend a lot of time trying to build a physical robot, right? They spend so much time making a physical robot that they didn't have time to program it to be intelligent, and of course it helped making a better physical robot. So when you set up a virtual competition like this, the incentives need to be right, so you get intelligence out of it rather than, but it's both. You see, evolution didn't just do intelligence, it did the structure, actuators, and then also the intelligence behind it. And there's an energy cost to making decisions and to having strategies. Just need one more minute. And what you also see is a tool in development at our institute called Modelica 3D, which I would like to use so instead of having these things that you guys are used to, which are simplified 3D worlds, and we talked about the balls yesterday that Ben wanted to model the world as a compressible ball. It's more complicated than that. There's shear forces, there's fluids that move around, but all these things can be modeled. We know how to do that. And I'm proposing that this be done on a centralized server. So we provide people with open source tools, not virtual gears, virtual muscles, virtual bones. They can build their own species, which can multiply as much as they can. And we provide them with a sandbox in which these things operate and compete with each other. And we simulate evolution this way. All right, conclusions? Can I go?
Sure.
All right. I'm allowed conclusions. And therefore, to conclude, all right, evolution is the only known path to general intelligence that we know worked. If you simulate it, it can also be safe because, despite what we talked about, programming morality and things that may or may not work, it's virtual. It's in a sandbox. We do control it. I also study a little bit trying to find out machine learning techniques to diagnose schizophrenia. That's one of my reasons. And so what can happen, though, instead of developing emergence of intelligent beings that are evil, what's more likely to happen is what actually happened in evolution is that you get, by scaling up brains, you get bugs in the system, and these bugs are like psychosis. So that's what we have to avoid.
Great. Thank you. Was that your lecture? Next, we have Alessandro Oltramari on visual intelligence beyond representation. So moving from action to perception. Of course, each of them being a broad topic, branching out into everything else.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I think that the focus of my talk will be much more narrow than the one that we see so far. So I will try to say something about the general problem of what does it mean to enable visual intelligence in artificial systems. And in particular, I will try to make the point for adding something more than representation in the overall framework. So I start with this general reference by Franz Brentano. So work can be represented insofar as phenomena are previously presented, so namely structured and perceived as experiences by human beings. What does it mean? So in terms of general distinction between computer vision and visual intelligence, you can think about computer vision or machine vision in general as dealing with information extraction from scenarios. And the state of the art is the performance is very good concerning object and features recognition. Visual intelligence is not really just information extraction, of course, from scene, but is trying to build some kind of knowledge structures from information. And in particular, one important point is that basically you get knowledge by adding some kind of semantic structure to these pieces of information that you start from scenes. For example, you can say that events are not just the sum of the objects and the features that you detect from a scene, from an external detected scene. The elements in the scene play specific roles, so they act in a specific way, in a specific scene, in a specific context, and humans learn to recognize a general pattern of events via multiple presentations or instances of these general event types. So how to enable kind of artificial visual intelligence that add this knowledge structure to information extracted from scenes. So just to try to schematize a bit the mainstream model, the mainstream theory behind how this machine vision and computer vision works. You have a kind of standard theory of perceptual semantics, where perceptual semantics means how do you build semantic structure, meaningful structures from perception. So basically you have some kind of a sensory dimension of stimuli and some electrochemical transductions that translate those sensory input into symbolic dimensions, so some or representation. Of course, this is an oversimplification, but I'm just trying to schematize everything. The kind of the right model of artificial vision is that you take some kind of sensory input like the position, the orientation, the brightness, the motion, the shape, and other specific optical features from the scene, and via some kind of information processing, you build up the symbolic output, which is the counterpart of representation of human representation in terms of computer vision. But if we go back to the premise, so to this quote by Brentano and other, and in particular in the field of experimental phenomenology, you see that the problem of abstracting from specific perceptions to representation is not solved at all. I mean, the so-called linkage problem is the way in which you try to explain how symbols are created, built up on these stimuli from the external world. And the concept of presentation, which comes from this distinction between presentation and representations come from the distinction in the Kantian theory of knowledge between Darstellung and Vorstellung. So the fact that you distinguish between the abstraction from the actual stimuli. The role of presentation is to make the filter, let's say, from the stimuli to representation in the human visual intelligence. So basically, you have some kind of dynamic dimension in the middle, okay, which builds up and is in an intermediate level between the level of representation and the level of stimuli. So human visual intelligence is able to add kind of so to build up this knowledge structure from information, filtering the stimuli using some kind of schematic structures. There is a huge amount of data from the experimental psychology on how these perceptual phenomena work, so how you really focus on some of the elements of the scene, how you combine those elements, how you put some structures on those elements, and there are also robust explanation on the single, of the specific perceptual phenomena. Cognitive semantics, for example, as opposed to formal semantics, try to understand how those, let's say, pieces of knowledge that you filter from the scene can add up into meaningful structures for natural language. And these obscured forms of presentation, these obscured schematic structures, so-called conceptual schemas, makes the difference actually when dealing with the complex cognitive tasks as action recognition or disambiguation, because helps human to focus and to extract specific knowledge from the scene, just to carve, to unfold the perceptual space. Conceptual schema in general can be seen as some like cognitive relations which hold between the elements in a scene, like the mutual position, the dependence between the elements, the salience of elements. And in particular, if you want to make a list of these conceptual structures, which are in a sense anthropocentric with respect to, as opposing to an objective and let's say optical based elaboration as in the current computer vision. You can find these among these primitive forms of presentation, like the path, source, the up-down, front-back, central periphery, the container, and some of the so-called Gestalt schemas, like the profile base, which is the difference between the figure and the ground, which is quite easy to understand. But for example, viewpoint and distribution of attention, which can be translated in some kind of naive concept of focalizing in specific elements from a complex scene in order to carve the scene and to understand which are the meaningful pieces that you can focus on. Force dynamics and scanning and container and so on and so forth. So trying to understand if these kind of features that permeate the human visual intelligence can be translated, can be implemented from the viewpoint of artificial visual systems. This is a kind of proposal of augmenting the actual architectures, the actual integrated systems, using those kind of features. Like, for example, at the level of low-level processing, so visual classifiers, which actually exploit optical features, could be augmented in terms of, let's say, kind of counterpart of forms of presentation. So trying to implement structures which can identify this difference between, for example, central periphery, path source, figure ground, and so on and so forth. At the high level of the processing, so for example, in cognitive architectures like SOAR or ACTAR, besides this mechanism of general human cognition like learning, memory, and perception, try to make some kind of computational rendering of these Gestalt effects that in a sense is a specialization of the perception layer of the overall cognitive architecture. From the viewpoint, and this is from the viewpoint of mechanisms, from the viewpoint of contents, so from the viewpoint on how you build this knowledge structure, these semantic meaningful knowledge structures, you can think, for example, to, let's say, enhance state-of-the-art semantic resources like ontologies, like OpenPsych, Dolce, Sumo, and computational lexicons like WordNet and FrameNet. And by the way, FrameNet, in some sense, already exploits some kind of general notion of schema or frame to build the knowledge structure. With this notion of conceptual schema, where, for example, from the viewpoint of the knowledge content, means to focalize on the object-action coupling, so verbs and nouns, how they are combined in meaningful semantic structures, or, for example, metaphor, which in a sense improve and add more relations in the space of lexical semantics. These are some of the references for this work. A paper we are going to maybe present in the AAAI Fall Symposium on Advances in Cognitive Systems, and a couple of references for cognitive semantics and visual intelligence. One is the most recent, so the third one is a new book by Bertazzi, von Tolden, and Wijmat, Perception Beyond Inference, which focus really on these, which has inspired me for this talk, and focus on going beyond representation in order to improve artificial visual intelligence system. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
My talk is simple idea. It's short. So we're all here. We're interested in creating artificial minds. So all of us in this room, we have natural minds. And one of the great things about natural minds is that they're all about equally good. We all speak the same languages. If someone else speaks French, I can learn to speak French, possibly. They could possibly learn to speak English. But our sentence structure, we all make sentences of approximately the same complexity. Some of us have specialized vocabularies, but generally we have roughly the same intelligence. We share the same daily skills. In fact, if we look at the skills that we take as signs of extraordinary intelligence, like playing chess really well, those are the skills that computers can already do. It's the daily skills that they can't do. So the skills we all share are the skills that really distinguish our intelligence. So I claim that we're all about the same intelligence because our intelligence comes from a natural process which just has given us all about the same intelligence. When we can build intelligence, when we have AI that exceeds natural intelligence, possibly we're enhancing humans and their intelligence, then we get, I think, a wide range of intelligence levels. In other words, that's where we come to the end of the rough equality of intelligence. If we look at other artifacts like buildings and vehicles, the largest buildings are much larger than the average building, and so on. And we can think of a social dynamic that will work that way. When your intelligence depends on how large of a brain you can afford to buy, and the amount of money you can earn depends on your intelligence, that'll create a positive feedback loop that will create this divergence in intelligence levels. So we'll have this great divergence. And intelligence is the ultimate source of power in this world. That's why humans, rather than lions, rule the world. Intelligence is what rules the world. And there's this great quote. I think the guy's name was Lord Acton. He died in 1902 or something. And he said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this topic has come up a few times in talks about what are our intentions. Certainly, if I became super intelligent, I would have the best of intentions. Nothing bad would happen, right? Well, check back 15 years later, let's see. So the question is, what about this? And I think that AI really, ultimately, is going to be a political issue because it's going to have such profound social effects that it's really in the political centers where we're going to decide what we're going to do about it. So we've heard a lot of talks about, and there's going to be more papers, there's some very interesting papers coming up in the main conference about what do we get if we say, here's the values of our system, what does it end up doing? Steve gave a great overview of that. Anna talked about that, and there's going to be some great talks. So it's a very complicated question. But the important thing is that there will be political will to solve that problem. No one is going to want, or no sane person, no one with any real political pull is going to want AI to run amok and do what we don't want it to do. So the wireheading issue, if there's a technical problem to the wireheading problem, a technical solution to the wireheading problem, there will be political will to solve that problem. But I think that it's likely, or at least it certainly could be likely, that there will be political will to team AI with wealthy and powerful human beings. Hollywood loves to make movies about AI versus humanity, but that's not the threat that I fear. The threat that I fear is a few wealthy and powerful human beings teamed up with AI against the rest of us. And even if they don't have the intention of being against the rest of us, once they have the power, power corrupts, it's a question, it's an issue. And I'm not up here to necessarily give you the answer. Ben asked me to say something about open source. So the first thing I'm going to say about open source is my t-shirt depicts John Paul II getting a demo of my open source visualization software in 1992. which has nothing to do with open source AI, except that I'm an advocate for open source. Open source is really a form of transparency. It's a form of making everything you're doing open and obvious to everyone. And I think transparency, if there is a solution to this political problem, is transparency. It is that the public, the people who vote, and occasionally vote for people that we can't understand why, in the name of creation, they would vote for those people. But those people need to understand the issue of AI. They need to understand the possible threat to them about AI concentrating power. And I mean, that's what I think is the answer. And during the, that's the only possibility. I wouldn't say the answer, but the only possibility is for people to understand this threat, to be made aware of it, and to hopefully act through the political system. Sounds crazy, but I can't think of any other approach. That's it.
And now for something completely different. Let's try this. Well, maybe not. Try that.
Right arrow.
That right. There we are. Okay. The first question is, can we actually say anything at all about the singularity with any degree of confidence? And, well, Ben got it. It turns out that there actually is some scientific research on the question of whether expert prediction of the future is worth anything at all. And Tetlock who's still working at this, but this is a classic piece of work, and it's been mentioned in a couple of more recent popular books. The title here refers to the old saying that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one great thing. Well, it turns out that what Tetlock found was that the average expert doing predictions of the future, and he made them write down their predictions and track them for years and tied them down to specific predictions. It turns out the average expert is not significantly better than random chance. But he found that there were ways that you could divide experts into two classes, the hedgehogs, as he called them, and the foxes. The hedgehogs were the ones with one great thing they knew, some idée fixe that they thought the whole world turned on. And it turns out that the hedgehogs were a lot worse than random chance, and the foxes, the ones that drew on a whole bunch of different knowledge sources and theories of the world, tended to be a little better than random chance, but that regression and extrapolation were typically about as good as the fox type experts. A bunch of recent work extends that kind of thing to the people who are actually doing the innovation and causing technological progress, as well as those who are simply predicting it. Like Kevin Kelly points out, that things that get invented tend to be invented by a lot of people at the same time. Johnson has the same thing. A lot of these are about trade and experimentation and so forth, as opposed to people with these great theories that actually come up with some genius development. And the Fox version of history turns out to be that it's the marketplace of ideas and not any single great individual intelligence that is really responsible for the way technology changes. Even arguably one of the greatest geniuses we've produced said the same things in his own case. Okay, so we take these ideas and they tell us that we need to look at what history says about the development of singularity and technological advancement and so forth. This is a log scale, and you'll see that there are basically just three different growth modes here. The first one is agriculture. The next one is what I call the mercantile era. which is inventions like ocean-going sailing ships and double-entry bookkeeping and the printing press and so forth that happened in the Middle Ages. And the third mode is the Industrial Revolution. There's a previous mode before agriculture that's essentially flat. And what we want to do is essentially just look at what the next mode is going to be. So here's a proposition. The doubling times have been coming down. The growth rates have been going up. And I'd like to propose that we're probably going to, in the coming century, move into a mode where the doubling time is on the order of a year, and the growth rate's on the order of 100%. And I'll try and back that up a little bit in the coming slides. Okay, here's Moore's law. This is Ray Kurzweil's data, and I've added a few data points of my own, but they all fit the same curves, and these are the fairly commonly drawn endpoints where the $1,000 will value a human equivalent computation or 1 billion human equivalent computations. And the two curves I fit here is one is a quadratic, and the other one is another exponential. That would be a sort of a double exponential. And the idea is to see if there's any great difference between a fairly standard prediction of Moore's law in the coming century, or the extra exponential, this being a log scale in the first place, is supposed to represent what would happen if you have an intelligence explosion where intelligent machines are making machines advance more rapidly than before. And it turns out that inside the coming century, the times for reaching given levels, like these two lines I have drawn in here, are not really all that different, maybe a decade apart or so. I claim that what that tells us is that the intelligence explosion isn't going to do that much more for the rate of AI and computer development than we're seeing already. The two curves fit, both of them, as you can see, fit the historical data almost exactly the same. And they don't really diverge that much inside the century. Now, after the century, that things may be different, but trying to take mathematical account of a double feedback effect from extra intelligence doesn't really make that much of a difference in the projection. Okay, before the Industrial Revolution, there was one technology, it was in fact information technology, that kicked into the Industrial Revolution's growth mode a couple of centuries before the Industrial Revolution, and that was the printing press. It used complex machinery, machinery that actually did production. It had precision interchangeable parts. In fact, it had many of the same things that you saw applied to all machinery during the Industrial Revolution, which kicked the world growth mode into about 5%. But the growth mode of printed material and scholarly work and so forth, books, had already jumped to a 5% growth mode well before the Industrial Revolution expanded that to cover the rest of the physical economy. But then the economy adapted the same techniques that had been used to handle information to the production of physical machinery, and the entire physical economy jumped into that same 5% growth mode thereafter. I claim that the same thing is happening now. I claim that the Moore's law growth mode that we see in information technology will expand into physical technology by molecular nanotechnology, using the same sort of digital techniques that we use for information now, applied to atoms, to cause the entire world economic growth mode to jump into a mode that's essentially similar to what we see in Moore's law now. And that's what we're going to see. I don't think we're going to see an awful lot more than that, at least in the coming century. There may be more growth modes to come after that, but the example of the printing press and the Industrial Revolution leads me to believe that this is the same kind of growth mode jump that we're going to see. Okay, all right. All right, AI is going to get cheap. Our AI is going to enter a Malthusian market where they will be so cheap that they'll be everywhere, and no AI will really be able to compete well enough to make a living beyond its own absolute subsistence. Chances are probably yes. Will it compete humans out of the labor market? Probably yes. In fact, almost certainly yes. On the other hand, this is what we want. We don't want to work for a living. We want to sit around like the upper classes have always done in history and have the robots do all the work. So if the AIs get cheap enough, probably by sometime in the middle of the second half of the century, it will be very inexpensive to provide each living human with enough AIs to represent the industrial and intellectual output of an entire country of today. Because the physical technology will be popping into the same growth mode sometime in the century, we can say about the same thing with the physical as with the intellectual productivity. So essentially, by the end of the century, I claim that each person will be his own or her own country, but the interesting part will be trying to get there from here.
All right, thanks a lot. We'll stay up here for the panel discussions up here. So we'll now have a panel discussion from this second part of the Future of AGI workshop. So Florin and Alessandro should come up for the panel discussion. All right. Any where's the microphone? All right. Here. Any questions for these guys? Okay. Talk louder, please.
Yes.
I have a small question about this dexterity definition.
Yes.
Basically, the definition is the complexity of the environment.
The change in the complexity of the environment.
Yeah, it's like a decomplexity of the environment, dt.
Uh-huh.
Right? So if you have a robot that doesn't have any sort of intelligence and is walking in a glass room, just kicking around.
All right, the entropy thing. No, it's structural complexity. So you look on Kolmogorov's papers, you'll see that the description complexity of any object actually, as you compress the random part, right, to separate the random part from the structural part, there's a point at which it starts. You can, meaning entropy doesn't count, randomness doesn't count, just the structural part. Do you know what I'm talking about? Should I explain this? None.
Well, the thing is, if you just break the already organized environment, then the structural complexity of the end environment.
Yeah, or no. That'll be a net, but it's an upper bound, right? It's how fast it can change. So if you decide to blow everything up, right? That might require an intelligent way for me to think of how to destroy something large. But so could a meteor, so could a natural event. A natural event could not create the pyramids. Right.
Other questions?
Yes. So for you describe this possible virtual world. Are you constructing this? Are you building this?
Okay. Well, right now we're just so you saw the screenshot which I showed was a simulation of a lunar land. Sorry, the question. Whether we are building this amazing virtual world which I was proposing. There is something in development, right? And it's a 3D visualization of differential equations. Now, just a word about differential equations and the different types of systems that are OpenSim and all that stuff. it's easy to simulate an ODE, and even there's multiple ways to, and libraries which you can do that. Things get complicated when you have parallel links. So this is really hard to simulate, and you need something that sets up a causal structure of the differential equation automatically, and that's what that's what Modelica does. So you can simulate a lot of different things, and FEM is a level of complexity which possibly we don't need. But in Modelica, for example, you can simulate a twisting foil or a cube, all right? Because there are analytical solutions to this, or approximations to the differential equations which work. So these things can be used also for thermodynamics and also for fluid dynamics. Any of these things that I've seen so far couldn't handle that. And of course, the idea is that if you do it on a server side, right? And nowadays you can download that stuff and everyone can use it on their own computer. If you do it on the server side, having a lot of these deformable elements, trees, blades of grass, whatever, that requires quite a bit of computation, and that's why I think it should be done on the server side. While the agents themselves, which use different libraries in machine vision, OpenCog if you want, everything. Those things can reside on a Linux machine, or I like Android, for example, because that's you want to create a sandbox, no internet access, stuff like that, right? No physical action. You want to simulate sensors, and the thing about Modelica is that there's already a large library of parts available. So you want a model of a particular motor it exists. A gear with backlash and all that stuff, it exists. So rather than, and one thing that I'd like to do, there's a friend of mine at Stanford who does this kind of stuff, is model muscle. All right, so if you want to talk about theories of motor control, you better simulate some joints, some bones, some muscle of things that of humans and of animals that are extinct and stuff like that. So there's some people that do that as well.
Any more questions? Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm formulating this quite correctly, but did I hear from your talk, Alessandro, that you can kind of take the percepts and then marry them to some pre-baked ontology like Sumo or Wordman or something like that? Or is it that you take percepts and you're sort of inferring that hierarchical ontology from whatever novel percepts you might see?
Well, yeah, if I well understood, so we are asking how this link between percepts and representation in the ontology, is it direct, or is it something that, because you said a private ontology, so in which sense?
Well, I'm wondering if sort of the proposed mechanism will go from novel percepts to a pre-baked ontology, or from novel percepts to a novel ontology.
Okay, both. I mean, you assume a kind of background ontology, like a general ontology, like psych or whatever. But of course, any new percept could improve or populate, let's say, the knowledge that you already have in the background knowledge base. Okay, so it's both ways. I mean, you can have like kind of pre-built ontology, and this ontology will be populated by new facts from the world, and try to update the knowledge that you have. So the reference ontology is used as a reference, but it's not just a monolithic knowledge base, something that you can populate each time. Yes. Okay.
Another question? Yeah.
The singularity problem, in which part the saturation effects you've been looking on, it's easy to predict that everything is going in a positive direction. But of course there will be saturations. For example, the temperature in electronics when the current gets too high, which already occurred, suddenly is a limit. So which other limits did you consider in order to make this prediction? You said nano scale is going to keep the gradient at the same level. How are you sure? What are the saturation effects you have to consider?
Well, I couldn't claim to be sure, but the end of Moore's law has been forecast many, many times over the past 50 years, and hasn't happened yet. And we have physical models of computational machinery that is very likely to be achievable once we get the production machinery for it, that carries Moore's law out to at least 2030, at which point it's pretty much cheap enough, and you will find yourself in the middle of that, even if it peters out after that. But my guess is that people will keep discovering new ways of computing. I mean, for example, imagine that the quantum computers start getting cheaper and cheaper as well, and they're not general purpose, but they'll allow a general purpose computer to do a lot more of certain kinds of computation. And I mean, I can talk about all sorts of interesting architectures and interesting device physics and that sort of stuff, but the fact is that people are looking at enough stuff now that it's very reasonable to imagine that the trend of the past century will continue over the next century.
What do you think about the implications of nanotech for computing hardware?
Well, I think that pretty much, according to the NNI's definition, we've been using nanotech for computing hardware for the past 5 years. But it's pretty clear that we can carry that down to the molecularly precise gate level. And in fact, the semiconductor industry roadmap for electronics looks very close to nanotech by the early 20s. They're talking about nanometer gauge sizes and so forth, and that's from people that have no torch to carry for nano per se. It's just that that's where they're going.
Understood. Florin?
I just wanted to repeat a point which I made. I know this sounds a little weird now, but I don't think computing power has anything to do with it. 20 watts is 20 watts. If computing efficiency become 10 times, 100 times what it is now, right? That's why computers are 100 times more efficient. That means, they'll have 2,000 watts. So I think it's programming. It's not the massive parallel of nothing. But that's an opinion.
Well, if I can add something, I think that my argument for visual intelligence is more or less the same, because you can have a very fine-grained detections of object features and everything from a scene, but the way in which the human intelligence actually perform from the viewpoint of recognition is not just putting power. It's just trying to have the right schemas, the right structures working in extracting the information. So improving a lot all these algorithms is good, but there are some kind of high-level things that can improve the overall situation.
I guess I haven't heard anyone argue that better hardware in itself would solve the AGI problem. I guess everyone agrees that better software is core to it. I guess the question is, do we also need better hardware along with the better software, which to me isn't 100% clear, and others are more confident of it.
Yeah. Well, one thing to add to that. The fact is that although I'm talking about actually those numbers I was using were Kurzweil's data and Moravec's intelligence computational capability estimate. The fact is that $1,000 is nowhere near as much as you would pay net present value for an intelligent machine. You can easily afford $1 million if you have a machine that's intelligent as a highly productive human, and you can build that today.
Right. Question? Louder? Right. So just to recap the question, the Moore's law per se has gone well. Other intuitively associated trends like clock speed may seem to have stalled. So some of these trends have kept going. Some of these trends have tended to saturate. And the question is, if you take into account the broad spectrum of all these technology trends that are relevant, then what does the whole picture look like?
Well, for intelligence, it looks pretty good because we have at least one model of intelligence that has a somewhat lower clock speed and uses massive parallelism, namely our brains. And in fact, those come in, as I have expert opinion, at about 20 watts. I think that as far as intelligence is concerned, the clock speeds are not going to be a problem. And as for the rest, I don't really see a major difference because we are going to be able to build massive numbers of parallel processors, and that trend does not seem to have slowed down at all.
Another question? Okay.
I have one as a hypothetical. Here we are. We talked a lot about intelligence, artificial intelligence machines, and here we are. What happens when I'm armed with a billion AIs and with nanotech resources at my disposal, and I decide to declare war on guys in Hawaiian shirts because I hate guys in Hawaiian shirts? What are we going to have, this huge arms race? We just sit there and just ratchet up? Is that the...
I'm hiding behind Peter Norvig.
All right. So earlier, everybody got scared of each other with this whole idea of armed robots. Well, how about this? How about that fact that AGI enhanced robots will actually end warfare, because wars of the future will be simulated. As the point of war is just to to make the adversary obey. So if your simulated robots win, then there's no point in resisting from the other side. That's a principal deterrent, and that's what happened in the Middle Ages and earlier, when armies would go out in the field and they would fight the war and the city would surrender. But only 200 people died out of a very large. So my mortality was very much shorter. So maybe that's a way out.
I'd like to make a point, if I can hark back to the previous session where everybody is talking about morality and so forth. I don't think there's a huge correlation between the morality of an agent and that agent's own intelligence or morality. And I don't think there's a huge correlation. The correlation is between the morality of an agent and the intelligence of all the other agents it has to interact with. The smarter the people that I have to deal with, the better I'd better be. And so if everybody else gets really smart, then I have to be good. And if all of us get very smart, you have to be good, and so forth.
Except that there will be a big gap between the intelligence of different people. And so if you have to be really smart if the people you're dealing with are smart enough to figure out what you're doing. But maybe if you're a lot smarter than they are, maybe they don't figure out what you're doing.
Sounds like Nietzsche with a master and slave morality.
Well, I'm not very interested in Nietzsche.
Yeah, well, the fact is that we live in a world where there are huge existing inequalities in not only intellectual resources, but other physical resources between actors ranging from individuals, corporations, and governments. And it's certainly not a perfect world, but at least to date, it hasn't completely dissolved in a nuclear fire or something.
There are big inequalities, but there is this one, the most important thing in the world, the most valuable thing in the world is a human brain. And we each get one. And I think that's a great equalizer. I think that keeps society. I think it's more equal than that. Works. That society could be, that works to keep society somewhat stable, somewhat equal. It's true that we have enormous inequality of results. The wealthiest people have a wealth that's 1 million times greater than the average and so on. But I think that the fact that we each have one exactly human intelligence is a great equalizer, and that's what I worry about, is when that
humans are the substrate. I mean, the active agents in the world that are doing things are not humans. The active agents in the world now are corporations and governments, and they are nowhere near equal in intelligence or other resources.
It's still the intelligence of an individual that emerges. You know, I mean, I'm not going to bore you all with all kinds of examples, but I mean, it's still an individual. That's the most precious thing. Whatever other information processing things we built in our society, the key is a human brain, and that's
substrate.
Another question? All right, we're done with questions. So since we have a little bit of extra time because one of the speakers didn't show up here, so I want to try something a little riskier for the next 15 minutes or so, which is to, rather than questions, to solicit comments from the audience on the future of AGI, in case any of you have interesting thoughts that are not directly questions for these guys, but are still relevant. And the only restriction I'd like to place is no one should go on for more than like a minute. I don't want long monopolies. So does anyone have any comments to make? They're not necessarily questions. All right, in the back corner.
So it's a very simple question, and it's, do we have any sort of tripwire? Right now, I think it's fair to say that we don't really choose our AGI approaches on the basis of their safety. It's rather what we have good ideas about. And I think informally, you know, there's in the back of those minds this idea that, oh, we got some human level, then I'll start worrying about safety and things like that. But that seems unsafe to me. So I was wondering if you have, you know, any sort of consensus, like, you know, once you start getting your AGI as one as a dog, or your research work is going really, really well, you know, it's already great for a couple of years. What's the tripwire?
Anyone have a good answer to that? Abram.
I'll just say it sounds like it would be really difficult to organize that. I mean, how are you going to enforce any sort of tripwire? You kind of have to say what's the realistic result there, right? I mean, maybe you could get it, but I'm not sure how you can do it.
Any other responses?
The tripwire will be politics. When AI starts having a profound enough social effects that people get upset about it, like, you know, whatever that is, going out of work, or financial crises and instability, whatever, privacy issues, it's going to be those kinds of things that are going to effectively be the tripwire, I think.
I don't want to monopolize anything, but I have a question. We talked at length about robots becoming evil. I've even talked about robots becoming insane. All kinds of things. Can anybody propose directly a direct societal benefit to having AGI? I mean, something that
Josh did that already, right?
Well, I mean, for specific application.
Doing all the annoying work for us. Yeah. We can have a good time.
It depends on what part of society you're talking about. I mean, the Foxconn, the company that makes all the hardware for Apple, has just announced plans to increase its robotic workforce from about 10,000 to about 1 million, and essentially robotize its entire operation. Now, chances are this is going to cause it to have better quality and lower cost for the stuff that it produces. But of course, it's going to throw the people that work for it out of work. And I think the big open question has nothing to do with robots taking over the world or any of that stuff. It's going to be what do we do when any job that we can do, any job, programming, art, as well as flipping burgers, can be done by a machine better than we can do it. And
we'll have fun.
Well, if we do it right, yes. I mean, I would love to have 1 million robots working for me. I could get a lot more done. But how do you get there from here? That's the key question.
Who can tell us how to get there from here? You can?
I have something else I want to
go for it.
So I want to talk about the possibility of a viable wild AI. So that is an agent that could live today and probably be a distributed system on the internet, like we could construct, and would, in order to be viable, would have to make money, and then all the things that it couldn't do, like hire lawyers for itself or assassins for itself, it would do by pay. Okay? But it's quite feasible to imagine that we could make an AI program which could earn money, by working in the markets, and then it could be, liable here in 2011. We could have an agent that the governments can't shut down because it's a big torrent.
Yeah.
It makes money and lives. It could be viable today and out of the control of all of us as well as governments.
Yeah, I think an AI financial trader, if it were not even an AGI in every sense that a human is, but with some general intelligence and some specialized intelligence for financial prediction, could rapidly become a trillionaire and shut down the world's financial markets. I think.
And the ability to hire people for what it can't do.
And you can do that using Odesk online with basic natural language capability and Amazon Mechanical Turk and so forth, right? So that's a viable possibility. Not this year, but perhaps sooner than a full-on human-level AGI.
I just wanted to suggest that there'd be a huge first-mover advantage with AGI, analogously to Google, who
or MySpace,
who succeeded with search and became this giant corporation today. So I really feel I have a strong team working with AGI that pushes the critical threshold will have that first mover advantage.
Well, Ben said MySpace. Think Alta Vista. The first mover is not necessarily the winner.
Yeah.
Very often first dynamic AI even if it's not the very earliest player, it does understand that spiral.
Yeah, one of the issues I'd want to bring forward is sort of my little pet peeve. Somebody said the other day, yesterday, why haven't we had more success? And I think the major reason why we haven't had more success is we don't have the hardware. This is basically, the brain has between 10 trillion and 1,000 trillion synapses, each of which represents multiple bytes, and it twiddles those things about once a second at each. So that's 10 to 100 trillion equivalent of multiple bytes of read-modify writes a second. There's no supercomputer on Earth that can do that. So it's my thesis, it's been it for decades, that you can't do what the human brain does without something within several orders of magnitude of the same level of hardware as the human brain. I believe, however, I've spent a lot of my interest following microelectronics, and there's some really promising things like memristors that really make it possible to make computers by mid to end of this decade that could probably be manufactured for $20,000, maybe $40,000, sold for several times that would be roughly brain level in many respects. So I think we actually have solved a lot of the major conceptual problems. I've been going around and asking people and saying, this is my thesis. Give me a major conceptual problem we don't know. Not
engineering. There's a lot of hard engineering to be done, a lot of trial and error experiments that have to be done. But once this hardware becomes cheap, and a human level box can be sold for maybe $60,000, 1/100th of that would be much more powerful than most computers that virtually anybody in AI has. And once there are thousands of those out there, tens of thousands of projects being done on these computers, and people with a lot of money could be running their experiments on 10,000 things simultaneously to explore the space, I think then things are really going to start happening.
Jordy, you had a comment on that?
Well, I don't think that counting the number of operations that are happening in the brain is a good metric for how complex it is. I mean, you could count the number of atomic collisions that happen in your car, and you need to know all of this in order to know how the car works. That's also not a good metric.
What is a good metric?
Well, we don't know, and I think this goes to my second comment on this, is that from my perspective as a hardware developer, the real problem in AI is software, algorithms, so we don't understand how things work. Now, if you really understand how things work, you can compress. You don't have to deal with this immense complexity that exists.
Well, it often takes more hardware to do the research than to run the system. Like, I was amazed when doing image compression research.
Yeah.
Why, for doing compression research, you require such insane amounts of computer space?
So the
but you do.
Here's my comment, is that I really agree with the second part of this comment. That if you have really fast computers or computing platforms, it's really good for trying things out. So if you have a bunch of researchers who want to try a bunch of things out, having very fast computers so that you can fail 1,000 times before you succeed on 1,001 time, that's really awesome. But I'm of the strong opinion that once we figure all this out, we'll be able to do everything that a human can do on a laptop.
Yeah.
Maybe you could follow higher brain rates and then one neuron or a relatively small population basic lab how it works, which is what I think people would want to stay confident. So I mean there's a possibility that our brain was
Is Dennis Hassabis in here, by the way? Or he wandered out? Do you have anything to say on this stuff? You know a lot about neuroscience. What do you think about how to measure the capacity of the brain and how it compares to various kinds of hardware we have now?
Well, I think my feeling is we've got current hardware in existence is powerful enough if we had the right algorithms to create an AGI. But clearly, like Woody said, more, and both the said, that if we have more computing power, that means quite a lot more things in the server. So that's going to help. But I do think if we already have how much hardware probably it'll turn out to run an AGI already existing.
But when you say we have, you mean we have on our PC?
No, I mean like supercomputers.
Yes. I said within several orders of magnitude. The biggest supercomputers are within several orders of magnitude.
Yeah, actually, I want to take a different direction and ask Dennis another question. This is just for fun, to bring up the question that was brought up earlier of what role does neuroscience play in AGI? And this will come up in a neuroscience session tomorrow, but of course now we can treat it more speculatively. I mean, what do you think about the potentials of...
Yeah, so I think I see neuroscience at systems level having two useful contributions to make to AGI.
Can you talk a little louder?
Yeah, sorry. So I think there's two potentially useful things that neuroscience at systems level can contribute to AGI research. One is obviously to inspire potential ideas for new types of algorithms for things that we don't know how to solve yet in machine learning. So for example, conceptual knowledge acquisition. But the other thing that's probably overlooked often is as a validation mechanism. So if I'm arguing with someone, my particular favorite algorithm, is this a useful component of AGI? And someone else argues no. Or maybe if we find that the brain implements that, so say, take for example reinforcement learning that everyone would pretty much agree now is potentially a useful component for an AGI system, we know that makes sense because the brain seems to ubiquitously implement that in the dopamine system. So it's a kind of proof of concept that it's not crazy to
talk about reinforcement learning, for example, as one major component of an AGI system. Of course, there could be other AGI systems you could create that don't involve reinforcement learning. It doesn't do that, but certainly it's not crazy to be designing some system with reinforcement learning as a central component. So and there may be other things that will come up from neuroscience that, much harder things to validate that it will come with.
Well, one thing that's happened is that neuroscience has come up with information processing models for the functions of various parts of the brain and even things like the retina of the eye. And you can take existing computer hardware and implement the same kinds of algorithms that do the same information processing functions and simply say how much computing power does it use to duplicate the function that we know a certain part of the brain is doing. And that's how Moravec came up with his estimates, which are about a factor of 1,000 less than estimates based on pure raw bit flipping power from synapses and so forth.
Just want to say, in this debate between, should we program it in or should we emulate brains, to me, there's one thing to say about it, which is that the brains themselves are created by a program which can easily fit on a USB stick, right? Probably even much less, which is the genetic program that makes the brain, right? That's a program. And that is a very short program. I mean, it's not clearly known how much of the chromosomes are related to brain development. They're not that big. So if you make the program that makes that automatically generates the structures of the brain that solve problems, maybe shorter.
Question over there.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to add something to that, which is that what you're saying is the brain was created based on genetic code, and that's sufficient. And I'm not sure if that is what you're trying to say, but if that's enough to then go on to say, then you can create an intelligent mind, etc. That's really not a problem, because that's like saying, if you have the structure to create a has a set of options and a certain way of working, and you then have everything you need for AGI.
There's something missing. I propose that. What's missing is the environment. It's through the interaction with the environment. So a baby born without parents and without a world which teaches it things, intelligence, and without observation, will not develop into an intelligent person.
Yeah, question back there.
I'm not sure if this is off topic. I'm wondering if people think that we're making progress on a problem that would help a great number of people as the proportion of people living longer then to produce a machine that can replace the years back on, which will enable the sound of individuals talking to be translated into something that's very audible. Instead of being a sort of mumble in the distance. You're all going to experience that eventually.
That's one of the best BMIs.
I couldn't hear you.
That's one of the that exists. That's one of the best BMI designs that has. It's one of the most successful. It's the cochlear implants. They really work. Supposedly.
My impression was that they didn't. I haven't tried it, but I'm told they only help a little.
Any other comments, questions? Yeah.
I'd like to raise a question of the efficiency of representation in relation to our discussions yesterday with Noah Goodman and yourself especially. He was implying that Markov logic networks were somewhat equivalent to, say, first-order logic as opposed to lambda calculus, and that if you raise the level of abstraction of it, you get to more of a, lambda calculus to a complete level of probabilistic representation. My own inclination versus, say, I assume that, I don't know probability logic networks, I assume they're similar to Markov logic networks, I'm not sure.
No, Markov logic networks don't explicitly represent quantifiers, for example, which is a significant difference in terms of their representational power.
Okay, then I can't discuss it too directly then. But still, I'm inclined to, and I'm also not a neuroscientist at all. AOI. working that some, but not actually claiming any kind of knowledge on the matter. But I'm inclined from just my intuition. I tend to think of things more as like if people look at representations more as a particle distribution, non-parametric distributions, as opposed to nice, succinct, mathematical things. People have to think hard and study hard and educate a lot to understand circles and you know, abstract concepts, whereas pictures are very straightforward. And I don't know if this is true or not in terms of how it works internally, but I wonder if sometimes the level of volume of neurons in the brain has some relationship to the ability to deal with things on a more of a particle distribution. I'm not saying direct, I'm saying that maybe it's an analogous fashion.
Yeah,
versus a succinct representation.
Well, I think Noah isn't here today, right? So, I mean, I think the hypothesis underlying work like Noah Goodman's or my own use of PLN, probabilistic logic, is, well, I mean, we're trying to use some of these mathematical formalisms to model some thought processes that are unconscious in humans and will be done even in small children. And I think to say that because we have trouble mastering the rules of probability theory, our minds couldn't be using them at an unconscious level isn't quite right. Because, I mean, most people are bad at solving differential equations, but in a sense, every neuron does that when it fires, right?
Perhaps the reason you have trouble understanding circles is that you're still using pi instead of tau.
Yeah. I'm not sure I got the gist of your question, actually.
What I'm saying is, big matrices, listed particle distributions versus, you know, parametric distributions, have a sort of power to them, although they're very inefficient. But they're very straightforward. And I sometimes wonder at what that means in terms of achieving different levels of complexity in different ways.
Well, it's an interesting issue. I mean, that's relevant in robotics, right? Particle filters are used a lot, and they've been less successful in cognition so far, but maybe they could be. Yeah. Could you speak up? Sorry. Well, that's really a question for Noah, who's not here, right? Or does someone have an answer for that in Noah's framework?
I can do that.
Okay.
It's exactly the right framework to use to model the noise. Can't hear you.
It's exactly the right framework to use because you can model the noise,
That's
according to him.
It's reasonably under understood noise.
He actually discussed noise.
Can I say?
There's too much noise. We can't hear you. I don't think that his system would suffer that problem, but I mean, you would need to ask him to get a detailed answer.
Having been here, the one thing that was sort of missing in Noah's talk, right? There's other ways that you can deal with representation and with probabilistic inference, and that was missing from so there's other things that exist out there. There's groups, there's people that do that, and that also fit data and responses of human responses, right? So the clear from cognitive psychology point of view is not whether it fits the data or not, but whether it how it does so much better and much differently than other approaches. The Bayesian for inference approach, for example, is one of them. So there's a lot of ways that you can deal with randomness.
Over there.
Yeah, just on the subject of the relevance of neuroscience to AGI, then we know that we can get human-level intelligence out of something that's organized along the lines of the human brain. And the theory is that it can be done any other way. maybe that when we try and engineer things from scratch, we end up actually bringing forth principles that are generic and applied to the human brain. But one thing is for sure, we know we can do it with the human brain, and so that in itself seems to me to be justification for studying the human brain and how human level cognition is achieved in the human brain in order to achieve AGI.
I guess we should call this to a close soon. We could take one more question or comment. No? Let's see. There's no one there. All right, no question. You can go. Yeah.
Just touch upon your question. I feel like handle the noise. There's things like biological models of vision, destiny, dementia, which produce these very clean representations, which something like random calculus cannot be able to. That's my answer.
All right. Well, thanks for the very interesting discussion. So we now have an hour before the meal at 7 o'clock, and we can continue it in small groups and so forth. Thanks a lot.